more on Secretary Blinken's trip. We're joined now by Victor Gao. He's chair professor at Soochow University. And Victor, you've sat in on these kind of high-level meetings where it's a U.S. diplomat and a Chinese counterpart. Give us a sense of what this meeting is going to be like. What do you expect to come out of it?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I interpreted for the visiting Secretary of State, George Shultz, for example, in the 1980s, and I'm really very familiar with the surroundings, the structure, process of such high-level meetings. For Secretary of State Blinken's visit to China, it is very important. It is a very important moment in China-U.S. relations, and I think the two sides have set the tone for the discussions to exchange views, try to grapple with the differences, but also try to improve the overall relationship. Now, allow me to add a point. I hope Secretary of State Blinken and his Chinese counterpart, Minister Wang Yi, would also talk about one possibility. That is whether President Biden of the United States could make a state visit to China to be reciprocated by a state visit by the Chinese president to Washington, D.C. If such a major event can take place in China-U.S. relations, it will really play a very important role in stabilizing the relations and also paving the groundwork for greater cooperation between these two very important countries in the world. There are lots of differences to be talked about, but the potential for cooperation between China and the United States for mutual benefit and for the benefit of mankind as a whole, if we aim at promoting peace and stability, will be unlimited.
Yeah, and Victor, as Dong Shui was talking about, the San Francisco vision, the two leaders sitting down together in San Francisco. Since that time, of course, we've seen Janet Yellen traveling, as was mentioned in the report. Blinken's been to China now a couple of times this year. So we're seeing more engagement on both sides. And of course, talks are important, but are we really seeing any movement, especially when it comes to the issues at hand, reducing tariffs?
For the tariffs imposed by the U.S. government on the Chinese exports to the United States, who pays the tariffs? One need to ask that question. China doesn't pay. The Chinese government doesn't pay. It is paid by the U.S. taxpayers. So I hope Washington will be more accurate and more truthful in telling the real story to the American people. The tariffs imposed by the U.S. government on the Chinese exports to the United States are more or less a tax against the U.S. taxpayers. This is actually one of the reasons why inflation stayed at higher level and cannot be really reduced significantly. I hope between China and the United States, we will aim at a higher level of cooperation. That is, try to increase the bilateral trade from the current level to, let's say, $1 trillion US. And the United States will do more to find more goods to be sold to China, eventually leading to more balanced trade between China and the United States to increase the volume rather than to reduce the volume. And if you want to impose tariff, it doesn't help, especially with regard to containing the inflation in the United States. Now, I think the Chinese government will tell the real story to Secretary of State Blinken, and I hope he will listen very carefully and convey the realities on the ground in China to Washington. Ultimately and philosophically, China is not and should not be viewed as an enemy of the United States. The Chinese people have all the goodwills and best wishes for the American people. Together, we can generate miracles rather than hurting each other and getting at each other's jugular.
Yeah, and Victor, getting back to your earlier assessment, that'd be great if we saw state visits between these leaders. Short of that, what are some of the opportunities you do see that could come out of these talks?
Well, I hope a higher level of pragmatism and realism will eventually prevail. For example, when Secretary of State Blinken said that if Russia gains more ground in the war in Ukraine, the United States will hold China responsible for that and punish China. What is the logic? What is the common sense? What is the decency of all such allegations? The United States up to today has failed to come up with any real evidence that China supports Russia in terms of military export, etc., etc. So China is not a direct party to the war, and the United States just recently approved a bill. Now it's an act authorizing tens of billions of US dollars military aid to Ukraine. I think eventually China and the United States need to work together to bring Russia and Ukraine to the negotiation table so that there will be ceasefire rather than the continuation of war. And the ceasefire in Ukraine will be in everyone's interest. And of course, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine should be fully recognized. And how to achieve that goal should be negotiated directly between Russia on the one hand and Ukraine on the other hand. The continuation of the war is not good for everyone. And it is a typical case of what Professor Paul Kennedy of Yale University said. It's an overreach. It's an overreach by a superpower. Eventually, it's coming back to haunt you.
Victor Gao, always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.